So good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to this nice conference, and also thank you very much for the introduction. I hope that my presentation today will connect a bit to the roundtable we had before, because I will be speaking also a lot about actors and about different categories of heritage. All right, ladies and gentlemen, a regular history boom has swept through Germany since the 1980s. Cities celebrate their historical anniversaries with large parties, they stage medieval markets, they lavishly reconstruct their submerged historic quarters, and they rebuild their destroyed palaces or famous old churches. You've seen the Frauenkirche yesterday in Thalys' speech. Countless historical relicts are being elevated to the status of landmarks, and tourist visits to historic sites are reaching ever new heights. A new museum opens in Germany every second day, while the number of private museums is growing constantly. Recent history is also becoming increasingly popular. In Berlin, for example, a private museum offers a hands-on experience of life in the GDR in former Eastern Germany, and if you are fed up with sitting in a Trabant car or spying on your neighbor, you are welcome to have a beer in a nearby state security service pub. This short outline shows that heritage has turned into an industry, into a heritage industry in Germany and also elsewhere. Not only communal, national, and international public authorities profit from this industry. Also, an increasing number of different private agents capitalize on the past. Historic themes and topics which are seen as being relevant for the present and therefore as worthy of preservation are in great demand, and they are more and more seen as serving to make profits. In my presentation today, I would like to show that heritage is produced competitively and how the set of producers active in the field has diversified in recent times. Moreover, I would like to point to the fact that besides the production of heritage, also the consumption of heritage has been broadened. On the one hand, more experiential approaches to the representation of the past have aimed to reach beyond the traditional well-educated middle-class consumers of history and to include new social groups. On the other hand, the price reductions in and the expansion of travel offers around the globe have led to a democratization and internationalization of travel, so that more and more people have been able to tour their countries or the world. This means that while heritage is produced by an increasingly diverse set of local, national, or global public and private heritage suppliers, heritage is still, and to a growing extent, consumed locally. Accordingly, I understand heritage to be a contested practice field in which the past is produced, represented and consumed as something meaningful and shared by a diversifying set of actors who present this past in certain places. This also means that heritage grants a past to these places. In that respect, memory only becomes heritage when it is publicly presented in a local place. In order to be able to analyze heritage as a complex system of meaning production and consumption, scholars such as Dallin Timothy and Stephen Boyd have placed it in a matrix. This matrix demonstrates both the dimension of the significances of heritage and the dimension of the scales of heritage. Overlapping areas of the significance of heritage include its economic aspect, that's its ability to generate revenue, its social function, which is its ability to build identities, its political dimension, since heritage can be manipulated for political purposes, and finally, its scientific aspect, which is the power of heritage to educate. the dimension of the scales of heritage is separated into the 4 reference frames: personal, local, national, and global. If we think of heritage in the form of such a matrix, it becomes clear that people can have greatly differing experiences in a place, depending on whichever area of significance and/or scale of heritage is important for them. The British geographers Gregory Ashworth and Rudy Hartmann have described this phenomenon as follows. I quote them: "A medieval cathedral can be an architectural or historical resource, an exhibition or cultural performance stage, a visual aid for historical education, an indoor element in a tourism entertainment package, a restful refuge, or a source of personal religious experience," unquote. This quote demonstrates that many scopes and scales of meaning of heritage may intersect in a single place. And these interlocking scopes and scales can be analyzed as diverse heritage spaces that are produced, represented, and consumed by people through their practices. In order to illustrate what I just said, I would like to present a case study to you in my talk today. It is a case study from Berlin that, as far as I think, perfectly demonstrates the power of architectural interventions in the process of creating different heritage spaces. Architectural intervention is the title of this roundtable. Precisely, I will present the contested creation of an authentic Cold War heritage in Berlin by focusing on one of the most intense sites of the Cold War, on Berlin's former Checkpoint Charlie. First of all, I would like to give a brief overview of the history of the place. Then I would like to retrace a continuing conflict between the Berlin Senate, on the one hand, and the private Berlin Wall Museum located at Checkpoint Charlie, on the other hand. The conflict started as early as in 2004, and it comprised several much-reported architectural interventions which triggered off a most controversial debate about how Berlin's Cold War heritage should be represented. In doing so, I will present Checkpoint Charlie as a contested heritage site in which local commemorative concepts clash with those brought along by heritage tourists from all over the world. And this clash, I will continue to argue, eventually led to a reassessment of local concepts of authenticity and to new architectural interventions that changed the overall representation of the heritage of the wall in Berlin. So let me first start with a brief historical introduction to Checkpoint Charlie. Checkpoint Charlie was inaugurated in 1961 by the British, French, and US forces who had been stationed in Berlin since the end of World War II. Being one of the few inner-city border crossing points that connected the eastern and the western parts of divided Berlin, Checkpoint Charlie was not accessible for the Berliners. Instead, this border crossing point was reserved for diplomats, members of the Allied forces, and for foreign travelers, for tourists. However, only the tourists were fully controlled here, whereas diplomats and allies were allowed to pass the control point unchecked, following the freedom of movement agreement between the Soviets and the Western allies. Until the fall of the Berlin Wall, Checkpoint Charlie developed into the city's most famous border crossing point. In October 1961, it became famous as a dangerously hot site of the Cold War. It was the place where US and Soviet tanks faced each other, ready to shoot, after Soviet soldiers had refused to let an American diplomat pass the border uncontrolled. Soon after the conflict had been settled, Checkpoint Charlie hit the headlines again. In 1962, 18-year-old Peter Fechter bled to death close to Checkpoint Charlie after having been shot by East German soldiers during his attempt to escape to the West. Notwithstanding this, Checkpoint Charlie also became renowned for more than 1,200 successful flights to the West. Many GDR citizens made use of its special status by dressing up as Soviet majors or American soldiers, thus crossing the border unmolested. Another event that made Checkpoint Charlie famous was the inauguration of a Berlin War Museum at Checkpoint Charlie's western side in 1963. The small museum documented both the terror of the wall and the flight stories, and it soon became one of West Berlin's best visited museums. And finally, Checkpoint Charlie also was a heavily frequented place, as it was the eye of the needle for all foreign travelers wishing to enter Berlin. East Berlin, sorry. When the wall came down in 1989, the former border crossing point soon became obsolete. Following its official dismantling in 1990, the place became attractive for investment. In 1992, the Berlin Senate sold the former borderland at Checkpoint Charlie to a private enterprise that wanted to build an American business center on the premises. However, because of a dead calm in the Berlin real estate market, the project came to a halt when only half of the planned blocks had been built. When the investor fell into bankruptcy in 2003, the void grounds east of the former border, passing into the private ownership of a bank, were gradually taken over by hawkers who sold GDR souvenirs to tourists. A few years earlier, in 1997, responding to the rising tourist demand for signs of the vanished border, the Berlin Senate had marked the former line of the Berlin Wall with cobblestones. A year later, in 1998, the former border crossing point had been further furnished with a large lighted box that displayed two photos of a Russian and an American soldier. In 2000, the Berlin War Museum, still located at former Checkpoint Charlie, had donated to the place an exact replica of the dismantled Allied border control point cabin. Combined with a copy of the famous warning sign, "You are leaving the American sector," the replica had re-established much of the former western view of the once famous border crossing point. This replica soon set the scene for a group of drama students. In 2004, they started to dress in uniforms of the former GDR's People's Police and to pose for paid photo shoots with tourists. Sometimes for extra money, the students even press original GDR border stamps and passports, or they search car boots for bananas. With this specific mix of offers, today's Checkpoint Charlie can be categorized as a quite typical heritage site. In order to substantiate this argument, I would now like to take you on a brief excursion to one of the heritage industry's pioneering sites, which is Plymouth Plantation. Nearby Plymouth, on the east coast of North America of the US, the famous Mayflower had dropped anchor in 1620. As early as in the 18th century, the place where the first pilgrim had set foot on American soil had been decorated with an engraving. In 1920, the so-marked Plymouth Rock had been overbuilt with a portico, which was meant to make the rock more conspicuous. In the 1940s, Plymouth Plantation Heritage Center was opened close to the rock. It comprised a museum that displayed findings from the excavation site of the old pilgrim village, and Plymouth Village, a reconstruction of this sunken village that was animated by actors dressed in historic costumes. The actors were meant to prompt interaction with the site and to add an everyday life perspective to it. The US-American anthropologist Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet has explained the surplus value of this specific combination of topographically exact markings of historic locales and artistic symbols, which she names as Exhibition as Knowledge, with spatial reconstructions and the presentation of historic originals in museum settings, which she calls Exhibition as Museum Display, and the staging of culture as heritage, Exhibition of Performance, as follows. So she named the combination as follows. I quote Kirschenblatt, Gimlet. The actual must be exhibited alongside the virtual in a show of truth, unquote. I would like to argue that Berlin's Checkpoint Charlie resembles Plymouth Plantation in a most striking way. In both places, we find a topographically exact marking of the theme that made the place famous. In Plymouth, it's the engraved rock. At Berlin's Checkpoint Charlie, it's the marking of the former line of the wall with cobblestones. The lighted box with the photos of the soldiers at Checkpoint Charlie testifies, like it is the task of the portico in Plymouth, to the wish to enhance the cobblestone markings with a widely visible contemporary piece of art. The exact replicas of the Allied border control cabin and of the famous warning sign, "You are leaving the American sector" at Checkpoint Charlie serve, like the reconstructed Plymouth village, to re-establish much of the former view and spatial structure of the historic site. And the drama students who dress in uniforms of the former Allied soldiers at Checkpoint Charlie? Their activity can be interpreted, like the offers of the pilgrim interpreters in Plymouth Village, as an attempt to recreate some of the social aspects of the up to then very artifact-centered site. Summing up, at Checkpoint Charlie, the initiatives of the Berlin Senate, Exhibition as Knowledge, of the private war museum, Exhibition as Museum Display, and of the drama students, Exhibition as Performance, can be understood as quite typical offers, the touristic value of which is enhanced from supplier to supplier, and the interplay of which characterizes experiential heritage sites all over the world. In the following, however, I will argue that Checkpoint Charlie is also a very extraordinary case. If we look into the Anglo-American debate on heritage, we can see that much of that research has identified national or communal governments as well-organized actors who deliberately initiate public-private partnerships in the field of heritage politics and tourism to exploit heritage as a means of economic regeneration, as an instrument of political power, or as a medium of intercultural understanding. The Checkpoint Charlie case, however, introduces a Berlin government that is highly disorganized. When the Berlin Senate sold the premises at Checkpoint Charlie to the private investor, they did so without giving any instructions as to how the famous historic place should be represented. Following the investor's breakdown, a potpourri of private actors was allowed to capitalize on the history of the former control point, but once more, without issuing any regulations as to what should be presented at Checkpoint Charlie and how that should be done. Therefore, today's Checkpoint Charlie is a place that has been spontaneously resurrected by a set of competing and not cooperating actors who try to exploit the tourist demand for signs of the former border to good effect. In this constellation, however, the private actors started to fight their competitors in an attempt to maximize their profits. And this situation gave rise to what I will present in the following: the construction of Checkpoint Charlie that had once been famous for numerous successful escapes to the West as a dark victims spot. This interpretation, Checkpoint Charlie as a dark victims spot, was prominently pushed forward by Alexandra Hildebrandt, the director of the traditional but lately privatized War Museum at Checkpoint Charlie I spoke of before, the one that presented the flight stories. To construct Checkpoint Charlie as a victim's place, Hildebrandt set out to criticize the hawkers and the drama students for capitalizing on the war victims' pains. This implied a scandalization of their offers, I quote her, as a disgrace of the war victims and an offense against history, unquote. For Hildebrandt, who even veiled her control cabin replica with a tarpaulin in protest against the students, it was, I quote her again, unbearable to witness how a memorial place was transformed into a Disneyland, unquote. In order to enhance the plausibility of her interpretation of history, that Checkpoint Charlie should be commemorated as a victim's place, Hildebrandt eventually created a private war victims memorial at Checkpoint Charlie. It consisted of a 200-meter-long reconstruction of the Berlin Wall and more than 1,000 wooden crosses located in the former death strip, each displaying the name, birth, and death date, and, if available, a picture of one war victim. Although Hildebrandt had only been granted permission for a temporary art event, she declared right after the well-reported inauguration of her memorial that it should become a permanent site for the commemoration of the war victims, claiming that the hitherto existing public offers were inadequate. Up to then, the remembrance of the war victims had been safeguarded by a memorial set up by the Berlin Senate in the late 1990s at Bernauer Straße, a quite far-out place where many had died in flight attempts to the west. It consisted of three parts. First, a sealed-off artistic reconstruction of the wall and its death strip, comprising some was an overly intellectual place that offered little more than historic treatises. Her private memorial, she claimed, was, in contrast, bringing history back to life as heritage, since it was dedicated to trigger emotions and to provoke empathy with the victims. Moreover, she criticized that the far-out location of Bernauer Straße left the impression that the remembrance of the war victims merely was an obligatory act for Berlin. In contrast, her Checkpoint Charlie memorial was located in the center of the city at a place that was heavily frequented by tourists anyway, as it was a well-known symbol of the Cold War. Therefore, it seemed just consistent for her also to commemorate the victims of that Cold War era there at Checkpoint Charlie. So for Hildebrandt, it was not the tourists who could be expected to travel to the city's designated sites of commemoration that had been set up at, from the local viewpoint, original historic places. Instead, it was the sites of commemoration which had to travel to where the tourists were. At Checkpoint Charlie, she argued, the experiences of the tourists would be far more authentic than at Bernauer Straße, as Checkpoint Charlie was a site familiar to them through the media. Notwithstanding the touristic success of Hildebrandt's Wall Cemetery, this line of argument and the staging of the Wall Dead as a tourist attraction led to a highly controversial debate in Berlin. A coalition of government representatives, members of the Bernauer Straße staff, and scientists scandalized Checkpoint Charlie as a Disneyfied site, where a serious period of German history was commodified and trivialized in the framework of touristic consumption. According to its critics, the private war memorial at Checkpoint Charlie was, above all, inauthentic. The location of the reconstructed wall and death strip was slightly displaced. The used wall segments had never stood at Checkpoint Charlie, but at Potsdamer Platz. The former border crossing had never been a site of the death of such huge numbers of people, and the form chosen did not seem adequate to impart knowledge on the place. By this, the critics of the private memorial sustained an essentialist concept of authenticity, according to which only an unchanged, complete, and documentary reconstruction of the original at its original historic place could claim to be authentic. This rationale, however, provoked a dilemma. Since the remains of the Berlin Wall had been torn down almost completely, also the public sites of remembrance of the wall had to do without historic substance. Therefore, also the wall memorial at Bernauer Straße was to be criticized for a lack of authenticity in this sense, for the following reasons. The remains of the wall at Bernauer Straße had needed comprehensive restoration since the concrete had been heavily affected by Wolpeckers Wall. The Wolpeckers are the people who hacked away the Berlin Wall, so they were heavily affected by the Wolpeckers work. And moreover, also the public memorial neither showed a complete reconstruction of the former wall and death strip, nor had Bernauer Straße been a site of death of thousands of people. As a consequence, the Berlin Senate started to work out a modified concept of authenticity. The solution was to allocate a specific historic theme to a place for which only that place then could claim to be authentic. Correspondingly, Checkpoint Charlie was defined to be the only place where the commemoration of the international bloc confrontation in the Cold War era with the tanks that faced each other could claim authenticity. And although Berlin's most famous war victim, Peter Fechter, had died close to Checkpoint Charlie, Bernauer Straße was classified to be the only legitimate and therefore authentic place of commemoration of the war victims, since it had been the site of many fatal flights to the West. This direct competition of a public and a private war memorial in Berlin finally came to a halt in 2005, when the bank on whose premises Hildebrandt's private memorial had been erected filed a claim to clear its grounds. The fact that Hildebrandt's pleas to the public to stand up for her memorial went out unheard showed that local support for her memorial was scarce. But perhaps it would have been just as scarce if Bernauer Straße had been threatened, since the remembrance of the wall in Berlin still is a contested theme. The forcefully removed private memorial, however, had a long afterlife. Only a few months after the clearing of the site, the German parliament embraced a proposal that the Brandenburg Gate should be transformed into a national memorial to the wall and its victims. The explanatory statement made reference to Hildebrandt when it brought forward the argument that the Brandenburg Gate, in contrast to Bernauer Straße, was an internationally well-known media symbol of the division of Berlin, and that it was therefore the best place to stir up authentic emotions in the minds of national and international tourists. So, what was the Berlin Senate's response to these private and public interventions? And what happened to both Checkpoint Charlie and Bernauer Straße? It probably doesn't come as a surprise if I tell you that both sites are in the process of being rebuilt right now. Let me first turn to Checkpoint Charlie. At today's Checkpoint Charlie, you find the so-called Checkpoint Gallery. This is an open-air photo exhibition inaugurated by the Berlin Senate in 2006. The exhibition tells the following 3 stories. First, it presents some of the local flight stories and some of the victims' biographies, thereby robbing the private war museum at Checkpoint Charlie of its monopole to tell the history of the war from the personal perspective of the victims and their families. Second, the gallery promotes the Senate's interpretation of Checkpoint Charlie as an authentic place to commemorate the international bloc confrontation with the US and Soviet tanks that faced each other in the Cold War era. And third, Checkpoint Charlie advertises the more remote, publicly funded local and national sites that commemorate the German separation. By this, the Berlin Senate's concept of authenticity, that I coined commemoration of historic events at original historic places, finally was combined with Alexandra Hildebrandt's competing concept of commemoration of historic events at places of international attention. The internationally renowned Checkpoint Charlie now performs as an informative hub that directs visitors to diverse commemorative spikes, which represent different aspects of the history of the wall staged at original historic places. So coming back to the heritage matrix I introduced at the beginning of my talk, Checkpoint Charlie today also performs as a showroom, as an intersection not only of the four scopes of meaning of heritage, the economic, the political, the social, and the scientific dimension, but also of the four scales of heritage, the personal victims, the local Berlin, the national German, and the international Cold War dimension. And how about Bernauer Straße? Also at Bernauer Straße, a major transformation has taken place. In the past years, the former memorial has been expanded to form a complex heritage landscape. A visit to the commemoration site now starts at a newly built visitors center. It hosts a film theater and some special event rooms, and it informs on other memorial sites commemorating the wall in Berlin. Adjacent to the center, a new outdoor exhibition has been set up in the former border strip, open 24 hours a day. It is still in the process of being built, and it will eventually stretch across 1.4 kilometers of the former border strip. A core element of this new open-air exhibition is the artistic reconstruction of the wall and its death strip that made up the old Bernauer Straße memorial, but however, some more artistic reconstructions have been added to the site. Rusty steels indicate the former line of the wall, or they help to commemorate the dismantled watchtower. These artistic reconstructions have all been set up at original historic places. They are accompanied by archaeological excavations of the remains of the former border fortifications and by several commemorative plates which mark the places in which people were shot during their attempts to escape to the west. Moreover, a so-called window of remembrance with pictures of the war dead now makes it possible to commemorate each victim of the war individually. So I'm coming to my conclusion now. Thinking back to the conflict between the Berlin Senate and Alexandra Hildebrandt at Checkpoint Charlie, two things come to mind. The first is that Bernauer Straße has adopted much of what once characterized the private victims' memorial at Checkpoint Charlie. Today's Bernauer Straße memorial explicitly focuses on the victim's perspective, and it does so by personalizing the victims. Moreover, the overall intellectual and textual approach to history has been combined with the creation of a heritage landscape that follows the idea of a more experiential approach to history. But disconcertingly, the discourse hasn't changed much if it comes to questions of authenticity. In all of the printed material issued by the Bernauer Straße staff, it is stressed that the new heritage landscape at Bernauer Straße can claim to be the only authentic place to commemorate the Berlin Wall because of its emphatic refusal of reconstructions. In other words, neither the artistic reconstructions, by this notwithstanding the changes that the memorial has undergone in the past years, new Bernauer Straße may still be promoted as being in accordance with the Senate's concept of authenticity that rejected reconstruction as being inauthentic and therefore Disney-like. Summing up, the architectural interventions at Checkpoint Charlie and the construction of new heritage spaces they provoked in Berlin introduce us to several new dimensions of the production and consumption of heritage spaces in times of globalization. If we look at the production side, it has become apparent that interpretations of what is an authentic heritage may differ considerably. While public experts, such as historians and custodians, usually understand authenticity as something fixed as the genuineness of a historic original that carries authenticity and that therefore has a value in itself, heritage planners and tour operators usually define authenticity according to the expectation of the consumers. If consumers visit a place purposefully, they usually carry with them a certain image of that place, and it is this image that they seek to verify. If the image is verified, visitors have an authentic experience. To fabricate this experience, it is not essential to have an original, since also a good copy will do to create an authentic atmosphere. In practice, the custodian's resource-based definition and the heritage planner's demand-based definition of authentic heritage often clash, which then leads to mutual charges of elitism on the one side and of trivialization or Disneyfication on the other. If we look at the consumption side of heritage spaces, the Checkpoint Charlie case of local victims, of national politicians, and of international tourists differ considerably, and that if the public authorities do not administer to the needs of these diverse commemorative pressure groups, private heritage suppliers will step into the vacuum to do the job. One of the most effective ways to do so, to create new meanings, has been the use of architectural interventions. As the Checkpoint Charlie case has shown, the private architectural interventions at the former border crossing even have had the power to change the public representation of the heritage of the Berlin Wall throughout the city. The positive effect is a more inclusive representation of the heritage of the wall, but the negative effect is that the public authorities seem to be chased by the private suppliers, and they seem to be changed until this very day. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Boa noite. Eu queria, antes de mais nada, agradecer o convite, agradecer ao Renato, agradecer a toda a organização. Acho que esse tipo de espaço é fundamental. Eu sou o cara oficial, eu sou o presidente do Instituto Rio Patrimônio da Humanidade, que é o órgão de patrimônio cultural da cidade do Rio de Janeiro. Esse tipo de espaço de oportunidade de encontro é muito importante, porque o cotidiano, e aí eu vou falar muito sobre gestão aqui, esse cotidiano pesado dentro do setor público, raramente às vezes oferece espaço para encontros e uma troca de ideias em contato com pensamento sobre a nossa prática. Então eu queria agradecer o convite e essa oportunidade. E também é sempre um prazer estar nesse edifício, né? Acho que esse é um edifício fabuloso. Eu tenho excelentes memórias aqui desse prédio, da minha época de movimento estudantil. Passei aqui dias interessantes, passei noites mais interessantes ainda. Dormi muito ali no GFAL. Ainda existe o GFAL? Existe ainda? GFAL era o Grêmio, né? Ainda existe? E eu queria falar por essa perspectiva, porque nós estamos hoje vivendo um período interessante no país, Rio de Janeiro, acho que aqui na cidade de São Paulo também, com a população na rua, com a juventude na rua. E eu queria começar essa minha fala por uma perspectiva de rebeldia. Eu entendo que as estruturas públicas, ou a esfera pública e o setor público são áreas muito propícias à inovação e com capacidade concreta de entregar à sociedade, à população, soluções melhores, inovações, novos modos de gerir. E é interessante observar, então, quando falamos sobre a fase heróica do patrimônio, ou mesmo quando nos referenciamos ao período dos anos 80, ao período da Luiz Magalhães, período no IPHAM muito interessante. Entretanto, nós olhamos para esses cânones com extremo respeito e não consideramos a possibilidade de ousar e de quebrar alguns desses cristais. Eu acho que essa é uma dimensão importante, ainda mais nesse momento que, de uma certa maneira, as pessoas estão cobrando do próprio setor público que seja ousado e que possa entregar o que ele promete. Eu vou, então, na minha apresentação, falar muito sobre aspectos de gestão. Eu estava ali na primeira mesa me coçando para poder mostrar isso para vocês. É um cenário, é um mosaico de cases, ou de soluções, ou de realizações que estamos fazendo na cidade do Rio. Esse mosaico é imperfeito, mas, entretanto, ele tem um vigor. E esse vigor, eu entendo que é um vigor do patrimônio cultural, pela capacidade de criar uma comunicação direta com a sociedade, a ponto de fato, indicar caminhos e realizar contribuições concretas para o nosso futuro. Aí, fazendo uma referência, então, a Aloysio Magalhães, que dizia que o tempo cultural é difere do tempo cronológico. Então, elementos do passado podem ter muito sentido para o tempo presente e podem também ser provocadores para o tempo futuro. Eu entendo que essa é a atuação do patrimônio cultural. Eu não sou funcionário público, eu fui convidado a assumir essa função. Minha prática privada como arquiteto foi, de uma certa maneira, uma prática perseguindo a possibilidade de desenhar a coisa pública e, num dado momento, percebi que as estruturas tradicionais dentro de um escritório de arquitetura são insuficientes para esse desejo, ou para esse sonho. Às vezes eu me arrependo, tá? Mas, bem, eu acho que a gente tem oportunidades interessantes. Eu queria mostrar um pouco, então, muito pretensiosamente, do nosso trabalho lá no Rio de Janeiro. E eu acho que eu sempre lembro de pegar essa imagem para colocar na apresentação, então eu sempre acabo esquecendo, mas a imagem que eu queria mostrar para vocês é o estandarte do Hélio de Sica, então, dizendo que seja herói, seja marginal. Então, eu entendo que o campo do patrimônio cultural, na atuação das cidades brasileiras, ele é um campo marginal. Entretanto, ele tem uma força, e essa força se manifesta e aparece de uma maneira muito concreta quando a população vai para a rua e vandaliza o próprio patrimônio cultural. Ou seja, há um entendimento claro dessa presença concreta do patrimônio como atributo pertencente à sociedade, à coletividade, a tal ponto que você pode chegar lá e destruir o próprio patrimônio público. Eu concordo com isso, mas compreendo essa dimensão. E acho que dentro dessa dimensão de proximidade, ou até de relação carnal com o patrimônio, reside aí uma força. Entretanto, vejo que os órgãos de patrimônio, as estruturas de patrimônio e, com todo respeito ao ambiente, as próprias estruturas acadêmicas, as próprias estruturas de pensamento acabam respeitando demais os próprios cânones e acabam impedindo ações um pouco mais inovadoras ou ousadas. Então, eu vou começar por essa redundância. A melhor cidade que existe é a cidade que existe. Isso parece óbvio, mas, entretanto, no contexto das nossas cidades, isso nem sempre é percebido. Todas as estruturas públicas de planejamento e de organização da cidade são dedicadas a produzir cidade. Temos muita expertise em pegar a natureza, em parcelar a natureza, em definir glebas, estruturas viárias, parâmetros construtivos e fazer a cidade e, com o tempo, num dado momento, almejar que essa cidade tenha um reconhecimento cultural. Talvez seja uma condição americana, e essa condição americana perpassa por todas as nossas cidades, produzindo esse esparramamento sem controle, que acaba, então, degradando ou tirando relevância dessa centralidade, desse aspecto simbólico das cidades e do significado das cidades também como bem cultural. Isso acaba, então, num círculo perverso, aparecendo nas próprias estruturas públicas e nas próprias ferramentas de gestão da cidade. Temos uma profunda carência de mecanismos para poder fazer o agenciamento da cidade que existe. Isso aparece hoje de uma maneira muito concreta no Rio de Janeiro, na medida que o Rio está fazendo um movimento efetivo de retorno à sua região central, em função do que acontece na região do Porto. O patrimônio na esfera municipal, ele começa por uma perspectiva interessante, em comparação com as estruturas, então, com o tempo heróico do IPHAN, é muito mais recente. Então, se estrutura a partir da criação do Corredor Cultural, em 1984, a partir de área de proteção do ambiente cultural. Esse era o momento da redemocratização do país, houve uma profunda contribuição da sociedade civil na definição dessas áreas, na definição de parâmetros para essas áreas, e o próprio corredor cultural surge a partir de um anúncio da Avenida Norte-Sul, que iria rasgar uma região do centro histórico do Rio, e isso reforça a necessidade da preservação. Então, essas estruturas começam por esse período, nos anos 80, nós temos ali 84 Corredor Cultural, ali em 1985 Santa Teresa, 88 a Urca, 87 no Porto, o Sagas, Saúde, Gamboa, Santo Cristo. E essas estruturas, esses instrumentos são criados pontualmente. Em 1992, no plano diretor da cidade, eles passam a ser sistematizados a partir da definição desse instrumento, que é a APAC, Área de Proteção do Ambiente Cultural, e que hoje, na região central do Rio de Janeiro, corresponde a essa mancha. Então, nós temos ali no ponto extremo, no alto, São Cristóvão, aqui embaixo a Lagoa Rodrigo de Freitas, ao Leblon. Então, isso corresponde a esse arco do desenvolvimento, vamos chamar assim, esse arco do desenvolvimento urbano na região do centro expandido do Rio de Janeiro, cerca de 40% do território urbanizável é então protegido pelo patrimônio municipal. Tá? Isso traz para a gente um trabalho intenso, além do aspecto do licenciamento de edifícios, um letreiro de botequim passa pela gente, tem que passar por uma análise nossa. Tá? Entretanto, essas áreas são essencialmente o gradiente, o grau de proteção para o patrimônio edificado dessas áreas é o grau preservado. Nós temos 3 gradientes de proteção do patrimônio na cidade, que é o tombado, né, todo mundo conhece, o preservado e o passível de renovação. Passível de renovação, o edifício pode ser demolido e a nova edificação tem que respeitar os parâmetros do patrimônio, não os parâmetros edilícios normais da área. Esse é um contexto, então, de mais de 22 mil imóveis preservados. É um contexto pesado em termos de trabalho burocrático, entretanto, eles não são tombados. Isso significa o quê? Não há necessidade de passar por um opinamento do Conselho, salvo quando temos uma questão referente à própria instituição da APAC ou uma revisão dela. Então, é um contexto de atuação bastante pesado, numa estrutura administrativa enxuta. Nós somos 60 e poucos, uma equipe de 60 e poucas pessoas, a maior parte, como sempre, de arquitetos, poucos historiadores, mas que estão habilitados a realizar esse trabalho do licenciamento ou fazer, que é o nosso objetivo final, produzir a gestão dessas áreas de proteção do ambiente cultural. Então, na história do patrimônio na cidade do Rio, você tem uma trajetória muito interessante, que é uma trajetória, então, que sai do conjunto urbano, ali do centro histórico, vai para o ambiente cultural e começa a ganhar magnitude, que começa, inclusive, a conquistar a paisagem. Então, o plano diretor de 2011, ele consolida a visão da paisagem cultural e a paisagem em suas diversas manifestações como uma instância a ser perseguida no desenvolvimento urbano da cidade. Então, essa construção histórica desde os anos 80 é que nos habilitou a obter o reconhecimento da Unesco. Então, se por um lado era uma área bastante complexa em escala, em diversidade, a entrada da Baía de Guanabara, fortificações, Orla de Copacabana, Parque do Flamengo, Passeio Público, Jardim Botânico, Floresta da Tijuca, por outro lado, há uma construção histórica paulatina e muito bem definida por parâmetros e por uma legislação, inclusive até por uma prática do corpo técnico. Então, havia um desafio da magnitude desse sítio, entretanto, há um ambiente de gestão bastante propício a dar conta dessa área. A partir desse título, que foi em 1º de julho do ano passado, a nossa estrutura, que nós éramos uma subsecretaria, passamos então tivemos um upgrade administrativo para o Instituto Rio Patrimônio da Humanidade, e está no nosso planejamento consolidar essa posição a partir do projeto de lei, a partir de enviar à Câmara dos Vereadores a lei para criar um instituto de fato. E aí eu queria, então, voltar ao tema da rebeldia. Quando recebi o convite, então, para assumir essa função, então, a secretária de Cultura, a qual a subsecretaria de Patrimônio estava vinculada, eu deixei muito claro que eu aceitaria o convite se eu pudesse sair de dentro da Secretaria de Cultura. E foi uma conversa muito interessante, você está recebendo o convite, e eu me lembro, foi a deputada Jandira Fegali, que ajudou bastante a gente nesse processo, mas eu me lembro que ela me falou, poxa, eu estou te chamando para namorar, você já quer divorciar. Mas eu queria dizer para vocês que eu defendo veementemente que as estruturas de patrimônio cultural ganhem profunda autonomia e, idealmente, possam se desvincular das estruturas de cultura. Eu acho que temos uma fratura hoje, não talvez tanto no campo do patrimônio arquitetônico, ou do patrimônio material ou imaterial, mas temos uma profunda lacuna em políticas de arquivos, de acervos, de manutenção, estruturas políticas e recursos para cuidar dos acervos do país, do Estado e das cidades. Eu entendo que as estruturas de patrimônio cultural passam por muita dificuldade na disputa interna por orçamento e pelos recursos que possibilitam que as ações possam acontecer. Então, eu trago para vocês um contexto de rebeldia, mas por uma perspectiva bastante pragmática. É necessário conquistar os meios para que se possa fazer, de fato, dar dignidade a esse patrimônio existente, de modo que a população, então, possa preencher esse patrimônio. E, nesse sentido, reforço e concordo com a mesa anterior, há uma dimensão, então, política importante no patrimônio cultural e que não pode ser esquecida. Essa dimensão política, inclusive, está presente na construção histórica, está presente no momento heróico de 30, está presente nos anos 80, está presente historicamente nessa construção. Por que não observamos essa perspectiva e, como atuação de patrimônio, não fazemos essa defesa com rebeldia e como um black bloc? Então, a cidade do Rio de Janeiro, se somarmos as proteções ambientais às proteções culturais, a gente está vendo ali a Floresta da Tijuca, nós temos uma cidade que definiu claramente o seu modo de desenvolvimento, um modo harmônico, buscando o equilíbrio entre o ambiente construído e o ambiente natural. 1973, a novela O Espigão. Qual era o enredo da novela O Espigão? Uma família tinha uma propriedade e essa propriedade era ameaçada por um especulador, que era o Valmor Chagas, imagine o Valmor Chagas especulador, e ele então queria derrubar lá uma figueira, não é à toa a história da figueira, na Rua Faro, que foi um movimento popular muito bonito, um dos primeiros bens tombados da cidade do Rio de Janeiro, é uma árvore, eu acho isso de uma poética inspiradora, ajuda muito a acordar de manhã e ir para o trabalho. E a novela Espigão mostra uma discussão de 73, uma discussão que é presente até hoje no Rio de Janeiro. Os cariocas e a sociedade carioca vê com muita apreensão o edifício em altura, a verticalização. E eu entendo até ver isso com um certo exagero até. Não consegue, muitas vezes, observar a potencialidade e os benefícios de uma verticalização controlada. Então, esse é o nosso histórico, que sai do monumento histórico para o bem cultural, para o meio ambiente cultural. Entretanto, nós não deixamos de ter um desenvolvimento urbano de esparramamento. Tínhamos uma legislação que impediu o licenciamento residencial na região central. A cidade do Rio de Janeiro passou por uma profunda depressão, na década de 80, de uma maneira vertiginosa, de impacto econômico. Isso começa com a perda da capital, de uma relevância política, cultural, e de uma maneira econômica se aprofunda nos anos 80. Isso traz para o nosso centro histórico, então, um contexto de perda de vitalidade, de profunda degradação, de baixíssima utilização. Esse mapa mostra a região da Lapa. Em vermelho, aqui essa linha vertical aqui são os arcos da Lapa, em vermelho, nós vemos imóveis com situações de preocupação de risco, não imóveis em risco de colapso, mas imóveis com atenção de atuação da própria prefeitura. Esse é um contexto, então, muito indigno, então, desse tipo de proteção. Se por um lado, tomamos essa decisão de proteger essa região central e várias outras áreas, por outro lado, tínhamos mecanismos que impediam a própria ocupação dessa área. Temos, então, um centro histórico de baixíssima densidade construída, térreo mais 3 pavimentos, térreo mais 4 pavimentos, essencialmente. Tá? E temos hoje, então, um contexto novo. Será que é o fim desse esparramamento? Não é. Mas temos uma nova cabeça que surge olhando para a região central, olhando para o porto. Essa cabeça olhava exclusivamente para a Barra da Tijuca, para a Zona Oeste. Temos hoje, então, uma cidade com 2 cabeças. E eu digo para vocês que isso é muito bom. É melhor 2 cabeças do que uma. Esse movimento em retorno à região central, ele é efetivo e ele se materializa nas nossas métricas e no nosso cotidiano de trabalho, através de aumento estatístico de licenciamento, de emissão de alvarás concretamente de uma busca pela região central. Então, o Rio de Janeiro está se beneficiando da definição da região do Porto como uma região prioritária. E o Rio de Janeiro, acho que está se beneficiando também de um entendimento que saiu das esferas técnicas e alcançou as esferas políticas, que é um entendimento tácito de que o modelo do esparramamento urbano, o modelo do desenvolvimento desenvolvimento urbano sem controles é um modelo prejudicial à sociedade, à economia, às cidades, e isso é hoje de conhecimento da própria esfera política. Os gestores políticos hoje têm essa compreensão. Então, isso que a gente pode ver nesse mapa, ali está a região central do Rio, é a menor densidade, a região do Porto são 28 mil habitantes em 5 milhões de metros quadrados, e a cidade hoje tem uma perspectiva de reocupar essa área. Então, é isso que nós estamos vendo aqui. Esse é o perímetro da operação urbana Porto Maravilha, esse nome não é dos melhores. A operação urbana consorciada, acho que é bem de profundo conhecimento de vocês, a Operação Faria Lima, Águas Espraiadas, esse é o modelo. A cidade define parâmetros básicos, parâmetros máximos de edificação. Esse intervalo é negociado, é adquirido, esse potencial construído é adquirido através de um título, então, regulado pela Bolsa, pela CVM. Isso traz um cenário de recurso. Então, foi nesse contexto, no começo da gestão, em 2009, que fizemos uma luta bastante dura de eu quero um pouco desse dinheiro. Se esse recurso está sendo utilizado na região, se essa operação está sendo realizada na região central, uma região com uma profunda pré-existência, com um único tecido histórico, com fixação de população, eu exijo um percentual desses recursos. Então, fizemos aí uma defesa. Essa defesa foi bastante dura, eu quase fui demitido e as nossas maiores conquistas sempre foram quase em função da minha demissão. e conseguimos 3% então desse recurso, de 3,5 bilhões de reais. Então, o patrimônio cultural da região do Porto tem 3%. Nós temos então obtivemos 110 milhões de reais para cuidar do patrimônio cultural do Porto, patrimônio edificado e patrimônio imaterial. Isso passa a acontecer, então, um fenômeno interessante nessa operação urbana consorciada, que tem um viés de desenvolvimento imobiliário muito presente, que, inclusive, se manifesta na própria comunicação com a sociedade, e o fato de, subversivamente, conseguirmos produzido esse recurso, possibilitou até que o patrimônio cultural tivesse a capacidade de sequestrar a imagem dessa operação e se apresentar e, inclusive, ressignificar a própria operação, porque conseguimos concretamente apresentar a recuperação do patrimônio e em algumas ações que eu vou mostrar aqui para vocês. Como eu disse antes, eu deixei todos bem avisados, isso não é perfeito. Há questões ainda a serem avançadas na questão do porto, a questão da habitação, a questão do centro fora do porto, mas temos hoje um contexto bastante interessante de reabilitação do patrimônio arquitetônico na região do Porto e também com alguns editais dedicados a patrimônio imaterial e outras ações que eu vou mostrar. Então, em azul é a área de aterro, feita entre 1901 até 1908, em vermelho é essa saúde, são os sistemas de morros Saúde, Gamboa, Santo Cristo. A gente vê ali a fase 1 da urbanização e nós, então, no patrimônio cultural, vamos aproveitar esse movimento e essa prioridade, vamos também atacar outras áreas, de modo que nós possamos forçar a criação de uma nova estrutura urbanística de revitalização. Então, consolidamos o programa Monumenta na Praça Tiradentes, estava há 10 anos com baixíssima realização, e também tivemos uma ação ali na Lapa de requalificação também do espaço público, que é essa imagem do projeto que vocês estão vendo. Então, a nossa atuação tem se orientado com o princípio de alargarmos, mesmo com uma estrutura enfraquecida, de uma maneira bastante ousada, forçarmos os limites dessa atuação do patrimônio. Começando a tratar da gestão desse meio ambiente cultural, da requalificação do espaço público, falando do que eu gosto de chamar desses conteúdos tradicionais contemporâneos, ou seja, precisamos falar sobre conteúdos capazes de ocupar o patrimônio, dar-lhe vida e também atrair a juventude, atrair outros campos de atuação para um contato próximo do patrimônio. Entendo que temos essa tradição francesa de identificar nos edifícios históricos um possível uso cultural. Eu acho que é muito importante criarmos outros tipos de uso para que o patrimônio, de fato, possa ter uma ação regeneradora na cidade. Então, nós tínhamos essa denominação, que era patrimônio cultural, intervenção urbana, arquitetura e design. Isso mudou depois quando viramos Instituto Rio Patrimônio da Humanidade. Então, fizemos uma atuação também ali no plano diretor para criar esse fundo, o fundo de conservação, e também estabelecer o plano de gestão dessas APACs, uma ação dedicada à Lapa. O patrimônio cultural na cidade do Rio de Janeiro acaba tendo a capacidade de ter uma visão holística sobre o espaço público, capaz de, na definição de um perímetro, definir ações e fazer a gestão desse território, melhor do que outras estruturas administrativas. Também por iniciativa nossa, tramita hoje na Câmara dos Vereadores o projeto de lei para a criação do IPTU progressivo, e também começamos a olhar muito para a necessidade de romper gargalos para que esses imóveis pudessem ser reabilitados. Então, um problema sério na região central do Rio são imóveis cuja dívida ou passivo superam em muito o valor de mercado do imóvel. Tá? Então, esse é um projeto de lei que tramita na Câmara dos Vereadores hoje para quem adquirir um imóvel com dívida e recuperar o imóvel tem essa remissão da dívida, um modo de quebrar essas cadeias que impedem que os imóveis possam se reabilitar. Do mesmo modo, em alguns bairros da cidade, o zoneamento é impeditivo para outros usos, também flexibilizar usos para imóveis tombados e preservados. E uma outra ação da autovistoria, que hoje já está consolidada também, a cada 5 anos, todo imóvel na cidade precisa, menos unifamiliar, tem que apresentar uma vistoria à prefeitura. Eu vou passar isso daqui para não me alongar. E estamos hoje muito dedicados a esses 3 editais. O edital PROAPAC é o princípio que a prefeitura vai pagar a restauração de fachadas, coberturas, instalações prediais, acessibilidade e estrutura através de uma seleção pública. O único benefício que existe hoje na cidade do Rio de Janeiro para o proprietário é a isenção de IPTU a partir da conservação. A nossa planta de IPTU está defasada, o IPTU não é mais um imposto significativo na cidade, ele não representa uma receita importante para a cidade, então é um benefício inócuo, de fato ele não consegue motivar nenhum proprietário a se capitalizar para fazer esse investimento, e isso então acaba inclusive produzindo algumas injustiças sociais, áreas carentes, com dificuldade de realizar investimentos, acabam tendo que pagar IPTU, enquanto bairros ricos conservam os imóveis e deixam de pagar IPTU. Então, esse é um edital para romper essa cadeia e, com isso, habilitar essa recuperação de imóveis. Do mesmo modo, esse edital de ocupação criativa é resultado de um trabalho nosso de mapeamento de vazios na região do centro. Então, identificamos próprios municipais e esses próprios municipais nós vamos, então, cedê-los a iniciativas, também através de seleção pública, e como patrimônio nós não vamos exigir a restauração do imóvel no momento da cessão. Uma cessão de 10 anos mais 10, nós vamos pedir nós vamos tolerar a restauração ao término desse prazo de 10 anos. Isso também traz para esse interessado em ocupar esse imóvel histórico uma perspectiva mais efetiva e mais orgânica de poder recuperar o edifício. E o edital também dedicado ao design. Então, isso hoje, esse prazo acaba agora, 6 de setembro, nós estamos absolutamente dedicados a esses editais, e isso tem ganho muita atenção da mídia, isso tem movimentado as regiões do centro, as comunidades, os polos de empresários, as pessoas, porque, um detalhe, quem aplica nesse edital são empresas de engenharia ou de arquitetura. O proprietário ele não aplica no edital. Quem recebe esse recurso público são profissionais. Ou seja, nós queremos criar o produtor da restauração. Existe muita competência na área de produção cultural e nós queremos criar também, de um certo modo espelhado, criar esse nicho de mercado que é o produtor de restauração. Como eu disse para vocês, eu tenho um apanhado bastante pragmático de realizações, peço que vocês me perdoem, mas nós entendemos que isso tem sido um modo bastante concreto de mostrar a força do patrimônio. Então, essa estrutura administrativa, que era uma estrutura pequena, ela tem também se beneficiado desse reconhecimento do patrimônio. Isso acontece na região do Porto, que é o que eu vou mostrar para vocês. Então, a partir dessa possibilidade de reabilitar esse patrimônio edificado, esse é o Jardim Suspenso do Valongo, ele foi restaurado a partir dessas ações concretas, mesmo numa operação urbana consorciada com um viés de desenvolvimento imobiliário muito acentuado, porque é a modelagem financeira que define, que produz recursos para a infraestrutura que faz o beneficiamento da área, o patrimônio passou a ter um papel de protagonismo nessa área. E passou a ter um papel de protagonismo dentro do próprio programa, dentro da própria ação da prefeitura. Então, o patrimônio, como eu disse, ele passou a sequestrar essa operação. Não é mais uma operação, é uma operação que hoje confere muito espaço ao programa cultural. Então, vou passar rápido essas imagens. É um jardim romântico, arquiteto paisagista Luiz Reis, feito pelo Pereira Passos em 1906. Do mesmo modo, antigos galpões, galpão da Gamboa também sendo restaurado, 8,5 milhões foi o investimento. Centro Cultural José Bonifácio também sendo restaurado, é um centro dedicado à cultura negra. A arqueologia, essa é uma parte bastante trabalhosa, porque é onde aparecem as dificuldades do recurso humano e técnico dos próprios órgãos de patrimônio. É a nossa equipe pequena de arqueologia, lidando com a equipe pequena de arqueologia do IPHAN e com os prazos e uma complexidade de atuação. Entretanto, é uma das dimensões mais bonitas e emocionantes do trabalho, quando você acha, por exemplo, a pedra fundamental da Doca Dom Pedro II, um bloco de granito de 1,5 m por 1,5 m, 2 toneladas, e dentro uma caixa de madeira, dentro da caixa de madeira uma caixa de chumbo, e dentro jornais e moedas. É um trabalho muito bonito. Isso é uma notícia de jornal de 1985, onde se encontrou um achado arqueológico e ninguém, se você lê a notícia, não tem o IPHAN, não tem nenhum historiador, 1985, não tem ninguém fazendo nenhum comentário, informando a população sobre algum aspecto histórico. É uma matéria de jornal de ignorantes. Da mesma maneira, o sítio do Cais do Valongo e da Imperatriz é uma estrutura arqueológica importantíssima de patrimônio material vinculado à cultura negra brasileira. Esse foi um porto de escravidão. A região do porto era um complexo escravocrata bastante duro. Ali se chegava, ali se comercializava, ali eram vendidos, ali eram tratados, ali morriam, ali eram enterrados em vala comum. E a partir do encontro dessa estrutura, criamos um circuito arqueológico da herança africana. Isso é um processo, envolvemos a comunidade negra, nas suas associações, envolvemos especialistas e criamos esse circuito que precisa ainda, obviamente tem um ano, precisa ainda ganhar evolução e ganhar mais conteúdo. É o próximo passo que a gente vai fazer. Instituímos então a lavagem do Cais do Valongo, já aconteceram 2 lavagens, uma lavagem anual. E tem uma visitação aí que tem crescido cada vez mais. E outro dia eu estava no metrô e vi essa foto. E o Museu de Arte no Rio, na Praça Mauá, também uma atuação que eu entendo bastante inovadora no âmbito do Conselho de Patrimônio Cultural, permitindo com que uma arquitetura nova possa aparecer, esse era o edifício de Portos. E esse aspecto, então, do mutualismo urbano, como eu falei para vocês. Então, há uma operação prioritária na região do Porto, e nós ali, como rêmoras no Tubarão, nos associamos a essa área prioritária e temos nos beneficiados dessa condução. Inclusive, em alguns momentos, ganhando mais relevância do que a própria operação em si. Então, se a Praça Tiradentes é uma área próxima do Porto, que nós concluímos o monumento, atiramos as grades, melhoramos o espaço público, e lá dedicamos um espaço ao design. E que depois acabou também recebendo o Estúdio X da Universidade de Colômbia. Então, é um espaço que atrai estudantes, artistas, empresários, arquitetos, designers, artistas plásticos, e é um espaço muito vivo, produzindo um efeito de animação cultural dessa centralidade. Era uma praça degradada, era um não lugar, e hoje ela começa a se constituir como lugar de fato. Então, o fenômeno é esse. Havia uma entropia, um sistema fechado, sem novas energias. Requalificamos o espaço público. Esse Centro Carioca de Design começa a animar o espaço. E a praça hoje é utilizada em intervenções artísticas diferentes, figuras ilustres, intervenções de artistas plásticos, Raul Mourão, com móveis. E o nosso trabalho continua, monitorando a área, identificando imóveis vazios, com foco inicialmente em imóveis públicos, procurando romper essa cadeia de degradação. E isso é o bloco de carnaval Chama Raul, na Praça Tiradentes, que eu acho que mostra que, de fato, ela passou a ser um lugar vivo no centro do Rio, um lugar que estava, infelizmente, degradado e morto. Então, como eu disse para vocês, no início eu peço que vocês me perdoem esse amontoado de imagens, mas temos um ambiente, do ponto de vista do patrimônio, hoje muito interessante na cidade. Isso se deve a essa profunda capacidade do seu corpo técnico, mesmo numa estrutura enxuta, mas se deve também a uma certa ousadia procurando ampliar a atuação do patrimônio cultural, de modo que ele tenha atuação concreta, efetiva, que ele possa reabilitar patrimônio edificado. Eu não falei aqui sobre as nossas ações de patrimônio imaterial, mas também temos nos dedicado a registrar o modus vivendi que o carioca inventou na cidade do Rio de Janeiro. Registramos o vendedor de mate e o vendedor de biscoito de polvilho das praias. O IPHAN torceu muito o nariz para essa ação na época, mas nós entendemos que essa é uma inteligência, ou, de certo modo, é um nosso projeto civilizatório que inventou um modo de ser na praia. Esse modo de ser na praia passa pelo frescobol, passa pelo futevôlei, passa também por esse conjunto de vendedores de praia que, a partir do nosso registro de patrimônio, conseguiram se habilitar como trabalhadores das areias. Então, não foi um trabalho de 15 anos de mapeamento desse registro de patrimônio, mas foi um entendimento de que esse era um patrimônio não consagrado, era um bem cultural da nossa cidade, esse tipo de ambulante da praia, e nós ali fizemos esse registro. Da mesma maneira, temos olhado também para as manifestações periféricas, como os bate-bolas, que são os grupos de Clóvis, que são aqueles blocos de carnaval, o próprio baile soul do viaduto de Madureira, um baile de mais de 30 anos na cidade. Isso, eu digo para vocês com muita tranquilidade, acho que isso é um modo dessa atuação do patrimônio dialogar com a sociedade que reconhece nesses bens culturais patrimônio material. Eu, então, agradeço, vocês me desculpem aqui a velocidade, mas eu queria mostrar esse cenário pragmático, imperfeito, porém bastante vigoroso, que nós temos realizado hoje no Rio de Janeiro. Obrigado.
I want to begin, likewise, thanking the organizers of the conference for this terrific opportunity. The last day and a half, or 2 days almost, of the conference has been a really interesting sort of meeting of theory and critique and practice. And I think sort of my perspective this evening is really going to be to talk about the practice of the Tenement Museum, the work that we do on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City, interpreting what is arguably one of the United States' most important stories, and that is of the ways in which immigration has shaped and continues to shape our city, our neighborhood, and of course our nation. The Tenement Museum's principal intervention, to sort of echo the theme of the panel, I suppose has been the preservation and the ongoing interpretation of 97 Orchard Street. That's the historic site that we interpret, and I'll be sharing with you some of that this evening. But I think that perhaps is the less interesting intervention for the sake of our conversation this evening. And so I'd like also to present to you, to share with you, some of the strategies, the experiences, the methods that the Tenement Museum has found useful in encouraging our visitors to our museum, to make connections between the immigrant experience past in the 19th and the early 20th century and the present, the late 20th, and today, the 21st century. Fundamentally, I think this is something that visitors to historic sites in the United States are fully prepared to do, and so I think it's fitting to begin my remarks this evening with a quote from the late historian Roy Rosenzweig, who with his colleague David Thelen in their book, The Presence of the Past, wrote about the ways in which contemporary Americans, contemporary folks in the United States are making use of that past, and this is the quote I'd like to begin with. Quote, "The Americans we talked with engaged the past to live their lives. As they thought about the kinds of people they wanted to be and the futures they wanted to carve for themselves, they turned to the past to frame their quest." And so we at the Tenement Museum take that as a point of departure for our work. The past that the Tenement Museum interprets begins at 97 Orchard Street, and admittedly, this is an odd photograph of the tenement building, cropped out of the context of the block, but this is all I had on hand, so you'll have to forgive me for that. The museum was founded in 1988. It's our 25th anniversary this year, and the centerpiece of the museum continues to be this building at 97 Orchard Street, a tenement, of course, the typical form of multifamily housing for poor and working class, many of them immigrant New Yorkers in the beginning and the middle of the 19th century. The building itself, located on Manhattan's Lower East Side, which, as you may know, has been an immigrant portal, an immigrant gateway, a first area of settlement for immigrants to New York and to the United States for nearly 200 years. The building itself was home, we believe, to an estimated 7,000 individuals from 20 different nations. Admittedly, those nations include in the 19th century, the 1860s specifically, the German states and principalities that would go on to make up the German nation just a few years later. The building itself was built in 1863 and was inhabited until 1935, when it was condemned as unfit for human habitation. The tenement sat vacant for over 50 years, until the late 1980s, when the museum's founders, Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson, stumbled upon the building and believed it was a site that they could use to tell what they believed was one of the United States' most important stories. Again, the ways in which the United States and its national identity have been shaped and reshaped by generations of immigrants who brought with them not only their much-needed labor, but their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. As the museum's current president, Morris Vogel, has become fond of saying, and I quote him semi-verbatim here, "The genius of the museum's founders was to take a slum tenement in a dodgy neighborhood and turn it into one of the most visited historic sites in all of New York City." Indeed, we're on track to reach record levels of visitorship this year. Nearly 200,000 people passed through the halls, the apartments, and the various spaces of the building. Many of them, or in fact the majority of them, are Americans of European ancestry, though that does not include the large contingent of New York City school children that are brought to the Tenement Museum and include many recent immigrants and the children of recent immigrants from places like China, Pakistan, Russia, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic, among others. The Lower East Side in which the Tenement Museum is located today is quite different than that in which the museum's founders embarked upon their project. As the current museum's president's remarks suggest, it was also a neighborhood in part characterized by poverty, violence, drug abuse, and abandoned buildings, 97 Orchard Street being among several abandoned buildings on that particular block of Orchard Street in the 1970s and the 1980s. This photograph here depicts what that street looked like at that time, the mid-1970s. Throughout the post-World War II decades and into the 1970s, the neighborhood continued to be a first home for newcomers, primarily Puerto Rican migrants and Chinese immigrants in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. My intent here is not to tell the larger and, in fact, more complex story of New York City's quote-unquote decline in these years. That's a story far too deep and, I think, nuanced for us to get into in the time allotted. Instead, hoping to give you a sense of the environment, the context in which the museum itself was born. This photo depicts the front entry hallway of 97 Orchard Street, and again, the neighborhood, the building into which the museum started its early years. Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson, moved in 1988. They discovered 97 Orchard Street and set about to turn the condemned tenement into a museum, again, that would tell what they believed was an important story, that of generations of immigrants who have settled, shaped, and reshaped American life. And it was a rough neighborhood indeed. This was just the period before the Lower East Side began to gentrify, and Orchard Street itself at that time was devoid of the many trendy bars, restaurants, and boutiques that now characterize its commercial landscape. Instead, they found vacant buildings, wholesale and retail garment shops, and the new non-European residents I mentioned earlier. What is more, the founders and their early staff were called homeless men, sleeping on the stoop of the building, crack vials littered around the surrounding area, as well as hypodermic needles. I'll point out as well, this is the hallway, the front entry hallway, in which all of the visitors to the museum begin their experience. And we've left it, as I'm going to show you as well, some of the other spaces in the building in this kind of unrestored state, which we feel is important to conveying the kind of layered history, not only of the historic site itself, but the ways in which it was changed over time by a variety of different actors, landlords, residents, the legal regime governing housing conditions at various points in time in the late 19th and the early 20th century. Here, too, is an apartment in the building, one out of what are 20 apartments, again, in this multifamily building, depicted as the museum's founders discovered them again in 1988, here in this sort of uncleaned up condition, representing how they founded. We use these spaces again today on the variety of programs, exhibits, and tours that we provide to provide a sense, again, of the sort of layered history of the building and what happened to the building and, in fact, the neighborhood in some respect after 1935, when it was condemned, as many others in the neighborhood were. We go through a process, of course, of stabilizing these spaces, making them safe for our visitors to pass through, but they look remarkably similar to the way in which they were discovered in the late 1980s. You're looking here at the kitchen and bedroom of what is a 3-room, 325 square foot apartments, typical of the size of all of the units, all of the apartments in the building. The next question folks always ask is how many individuals called one of these apartments home, and our records indicate that the average is about 5 or 6 individuals, but as many as 10 or 11 of an immigrant family living in one of these apartments. While most historic sites in the United States celebrate or tell the stories of famous individuals, inventors, writers, industrialists, politicians, our historic site honors and tells the stories of ordinary people. Indeed, we celebrate the ordinary. We study the everyday lives of the people who once called this building home in order to better understand the history of New York and the making and remaking of American identity. There were many conversations about how to interpret these spaces in the early history of the museum. Some experts who were consulted, historians, preservationists, museum curators, advised the museums to use the apartments as gallery spaces with exhibit cases and text on walls. Others advised us to fix up the apartments to depict the homes of different ethnic groups that lived in New York's tenements, including Italians, Jews, Puerto Ricans, Chinese, and African Americans. In their estimation, however, there was little chance of finding out much about the actual people who lived at 97 Orchard Street. Instead, they suggested the museum would tell quote-unquote composite stories representative of the experiences of these large immigrant and migrant groups who had successively called the Lower East Side home over the past 150 years. However, after reviewing a whole range of sources, including census records, court documents, birth and death certificates, voter registrations, the museum discovered that the names of 1,500 individuals, the stories of 1,500 individuals of the estimated 7,000 that I had mentioned earlier that lived within its walls. Of course, all European immigrants, predominantly Germans, Irish, East European Jews, and Italians. Using documents like this 1900 census that I pictured here, this is the 1900 US Census or federal census for the building, the museum has restored 7 apartments and 1 business ranging from the 1860s to the 1930s, in which the stories of actual families who called the building home are told. Indeed, the type of research on which all of the museum's exhibits and programs are built is best described as genealogical, and not unlike the kind of research many of our visitors undertake to trace the histories of their own families. And in some ways, I think the creation of the Tenement Museum in the late 1980s and early 1990s represented the public incarnation of the social history movement pioneered by scholars who during the 1960s and 1970s recovered and told the stories of ordinary Americans, African slaves, working class laborers, immigrants, and Native Americans, to name just a few. Yet, the museum's mission moves beyond that. The founders envisioned a cultural institution that would be more than a heritage museum. The Tenement Museum would be a historic site whose guiding spirit would seek to use the stories of past immigrant lives that unfolded within its 20 apartments as a means of engaging visitors in a conversation about the relationship between immigration, past and present. What is more, using the past as a touchstone, the museum would endeavor to shape the national conversation about immigration taking place today. That spirit remains true and is encapsulated in our recently revised mission, which you can see here. All of the museum's interpretive programs are driven by the mission, rooted firmly in place, Manhattan's Lower East Side, but more importantly, the mission establishes the museum's primary focus on history as a tool for forging emotional connections between visitors and immigrants past and present, as well as enhancing appreciation, for the profound role immigration has played and continues to play in shaping America's evolving national identity. Today's Lower East Side, of course, in some ways at least, lends itself to such comparisons. While the neighborhood has undergone considerable gentrification over the last 25 years, in many ways it remains a first place of settlement, a first home for new immigrants to New York and to America. Indeed, large tracts of the Lower East Side have in effect become an extension of an enlarged and growing Chinatown. Nearly 40% of the area's residents are foreign-born, and this, of course, does not include the native-born children of immigrants. While the Lower East Side has ceased to be the primary gateway for newly arriving immigrants to New York, many now, of course, make their first homes on the periphery of Manhattan, in parts of Brooklyn and Queens. Its status as a diverse, polyglot neighborhood allows museum programs to purposefully start in the present and travel backwards into the past through an exploration of the layered history of 97 Orchard Street. That trip to the past and the core visitor experience at the Tenement Museum is a guided, educator-led tour of the building. Visitors to the museum tour apartments that have been recreated to represent the homes of actual former families, recreated to depict different moments in time in the building's history. It's a deep and nuanced process, the recreation of these late 19th and early 20th century homes, that includes investigations in the building's historic fabric, its paint, its wallpaper, its linoleum, and the material culture of immigration and tenement life. Unlike a lot of historic homes in the United States, the tenement did not come with all of the furnishings, with all of the artifacts, with all of the objects that were part of the everyday life of its former residents. And again, building upon the personal connections that visitors make to the stories of 97 Orchard Street's former residents, the museum creates exhibits, tours, and programs that actively encourage them to confront their assumptions about immigration and consider the central questions surrounding immigration, both past and present. I should point out here that what's depicted on this tour is one of those apartments recreated to be a 1890s home of a Polish Jewish family who not only lived in that 325 square foot space, but operated a small garment factory from their home. And I'll share with you more of that story now. The content and themes for the museum's interpretive programs grow out of extensive research, of course, about the building. While our tours begin in the present, choosing which of 97 Orchards' many stories to tell does not. In other words, we do not begin with a contemporary issue and seek a corresponding historical narrative to provide perspective. Rather, we select historical narratives that are both compelling stories in and of themselves and have the ability to raise, in an organic way, we hope, contemporary social issues. For example, the decision to interpret the experience of the Levine family, the recreated home of which I showed you just a moment ago, grew out of what museum researchers learned about their lives in the building. According to this 1892 city directory, and highlighted there is Harris Levine, the father of the family and the proprietor of the garment factory, Harris Levine was employed as a dressmaker while living in the building during this year, 1892. Working as a dressmaker placed Harris, of course, among the thousands of Lower East Side immigrants working in the garment industry during those last decades of the 19th century. Since Harris Levine was making clothing at home during the 1890s, we refer to his apartment as a sweatshop, and in fact engage our visitors in a conversation about what that word means, both in historical context and today. According to this 1895 New York State factory inspector's report, Harris operated, a dress manufacturing enterprise out of the family's 325 square foot apartment, where he also employed 3 additional workers, 1 male and 2 females, 6 days a week for 10 hours a day. Harris and his workers were not alone. They were one of 23 individual tenement apartment garment factories operating on this single block of Orchard Street during the mid-1890s. During this period, I should add that nearly 70% of women's clothing in the United States was manufactured within the borders of the neighborhood. And here we seek to interpret the stories of the Levine family and their dress factory from multiple perspectives. That not only of the factory inspectors who enumerated the report, but social reformers like Jacob Riis, union organizers in the garment industry, and the Levines and their workers themselves. We in part do so by sharing these primary historical documents with museum visitors as part of the experience, using them to pose questions about the kinds of choices 97 Orchard's immigrant residents made in the process of adapting to life in New York and America. For example, this factory inspector's report indicates that the Levines, as I mentioned, operated their factory 6 days a week, ceasing to manufacture dresses on Sundays. Owning his own shop and operating out of his home not only allowed Levine to save the expense of a rented space in which to make the dresses, but allowed him to make choices about how he would maintain the traditions of his families and, of course, the workers of theirs. In short, closing the shop on Sunday allowed them to observe Shabbos, or the Sabbath, on Saturday, as their families had done for generations. The story that emerged from our research was one that had both historical and contemporary relevance. Many of the apparel industry's problems in the 19th century are similar to problems that the industry faces today, though the size of the industry in New York City is, of course, somewhat diminished than it once was when this particular exhibit and tour began in the early part of the 21st century in about 2001. As a result, the museum decided to recreate the Levine family apartment as part of a tour that would explore the experiences of immigrants in the garment industry, both past and present, entitled Sweatshop Workers. Visitors not only tour the Levine apartment and hear their story, but also hear short statements about work in today's garment industry from multiple perspectives: workers, bosses, union officials, among others. The goal here is to seed the tour with content from both the past and the present, as a means of engaging our visitors in a conversation, as I've said, about the relationship between the past and the present and the role that immigration has played in our communities. We believe that using the stories of actual former residents of the building allows us to complicate the often popular and nostalgic images of immigrants that our visitors bring with them. For example, Italian immigrants Adolfo and Rosario Baldizzi, residents of the building between 1928 and 1935, are believed to be what we might call illegal or undocumented immigrants today. According to their New York-born daughter, Josephine, who's pictured here at the roof of the building about 1935 with her younger brother, John, her parents arrived in 1923 from Palermo, Sicily. Or I should say her father arrived in 1923 from Palermo, Sicily, with the intent of bringing his wife Rosaria to New York the following year. However, 1924 marked the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act, the United States' most restrictive immigration law up to that point. It all but, quote-unquote, closed the door to the tens of thousands of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who had emigrated in the decades before. Faced with this obstruction, Rosario arrived in New York in that same year of 1924 with falsified papers, falsified name, and her and Adolfo, according to the story that's been passed down, left for Canada and then entered the United States lawfully. While much of this story has been, as I said, passed down as family lore, the museum has to date been unable to substantiate it in its entirety, including in the narrative, nonetheless, that the museum shares, because we feel it helped complicates the image of early 20th century arrival for European immigrants, often our visitors' own grandparents or great-grandparents, as well as that of contemporary immigrants, many of whom are believed to have entered the United States illegally today. Planting such a seed in the story of the Baldizzis often grows organically into a discussion about illegal immigration in the present and what that means for our own communities today. My slide does not want to advance. We'll keep trying. The slide that may appear shows part of what is our latest exhibit called Shop Life, which interprets the ground floor commercial space of 97 Orchard and tells the story of several of the immigrant shopkeepers who are believed to have operated their businesses out of that space, a foothold, if you will, in America. This includes a German lager beer saloon in the 1860s and a ladies' undergarment store in the late 1970s, because although the building was closed to residents, was condemned as a residence, the commercial spaces continued to operate. There we go, that's the, that's the slide. And what you see here is the means of telling part of that story. An interactive sales counter is the term that we've been using for it. And really, it's a virtual way for our visitors to play historian, to experience and to work with and to understand the stories of these immigrant shopkeepers by working with a variety of the historical documents, oral histories, and so forth that we've used to piece together the story. Here, too, in this exhibit, the museum's interpretation extends into the present, with a series of culminating videos that depict interviews with shopkeepers working on today's Lower East Side. The educator or tour guide leading the program selects which video will best further the discussion they have attempted to engage visitors in. One of those videos briefly tells the story of Dominican-born Rafael Esteban, he's pictured here in a still from the video, and the Chinese-Hispanic grocery he and his family run today. He tells of the day when, nearly 20 years ago, the Lower East Side's Latino population began to ebb and its Chinese immigrant population surge. He changed the business name from Esteban Grocery, which it had been since the 1970s when his family arrived, to the Chinese Hispanic Grocery so that it would seem more welcoming to the area's newest newcomers. He even talks about how he learned a few words of Chinese to help facilitate his customers' purchases as well. In a sense, as I've mentioned, this emphasis on making the past relevant to both local and national issues in the present has long been a formative part of the Tenement Museum's work. In its shared journeys and family literacy programs, one of which is pictured here, recent immigrants to New York visit the museum as part of a guided or existing ESOL, or English for Speakers of Other Languages classes, provided at institutions throughout the city. As part of these workshops, groups tour the museum, share their own immigrant stories, and learn additional English language skills. Members of the museum's education department conduct considerable outreach to immigrant organizations that offer ESOL classes to the recently arrived. Not only on the Lower East Side, I should say, but as I've mentioned, in many of the city's new gateway neighborhoods, places like Jackson Heights and Flushing in Queens, or Sunset Park or Kensington in Brooklyn. But the Tenement Museum's work with the local community, and I think its status as a neighborhood cultural institution, has occasionally become contentious, and I think some of the museum staff have, over the course of its history, made several missteps. One of those involves this building here, which you could see under construction, its neighbor at 99 Orchard Street, which in the late 1990s and early 2000s undertook a gut renovation project. This building had likewise been vacant since the 1930s. And in doing so, they failed to observe the laws governing construction next to a National Historic Landmark and effectively undermine the foundation of the building, causing significant damage. Now, the museum, because of this, initiated eminent domain proceedings in the state of New York to have essentially the government take 99 Orchard, its neighbor, for public use, that of the museum. The museum, in a sense, sort of presented this as an opportunity for expansion and less as a danger to its historic site. And to say that this was not well received by the Lower East Side community would I think really be an understatement. This is of course before my time at the museum, but we continue to deal with the legacy in our work with the community with this from this particular misstep. Another one of those, I think, missteps occurred in 2005 when the museum spearheaded an effort to create a New York City landmark district. Such designation from the New York City Landmarks Commission would prevent owners of buildings on the Lower East Side from demolishing their buildings within the boundaries of the district and really mandate approval for any changes to the facades of their properties. Many within the community thought this was a necessary endeavor. During the preceding 5 years, as changes gentrification were ongoing on the Lower East Side. Scores of late 19th and early 20th century tenements were being torn down, in many cases to make way for high-rise condominiums and hotels. The museum engaged a seasoned housing advocate, who had worked on the Lower East Side for over a decade and had existing relationships within the community. And here you can see the proposed boundaries of the district, which has issues of its own that I won't quite go into, and some of the properties within the district, the proposed district itself. One reason I include this is because I think they, again, made a serious misstep in this work, and that was they failed to really sort of reach out, in particular to the Chinese immigrant community, many of whom had become building owners, and really were sort of, I think, frightened by what this potential landmark district would mean for their ability to renovate their properties and to rent them at a profit. Work on a new project and a new exhibit hopes to address some of these challenges. Cited in a new building that I have pictured here, this is from just a few years ago, about 2011. This is 103 Orchard Street on the corner of the same block of 97 Orchard. And on the ground floor, you can see the museum's new visitor center. This building, unlike 97 Orchard, has been continuously inhabited since 1888 when it was first built. Indeed, the museum's a landlord in the 3 upper residential floors of the building, an interesting position for us to be in both a cultural institution, and a landlord. But the hope here is that in the long term, we will be able to interpret the end of the race-based immigration quota system instituted in 1924, representing the stories of some of the residents of the building in that period, including post-World War II Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, or Holocaust survivors, allowed into the country under temporary refugee acts in the late 1940s, Puerto Ricans recruited to work in New York while the quota system excluded East European and Southern Europeans, and Chinese immigrants who moved into the building after the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 ended the quota system. Taken separately, recreating and exhibiting these apartments will allow the museum to tell the stories of 3 discrete immigrant waves. Taken together, recreating and exhibiting these apartments will allow the museum to explain how Americans regain the confidence to constitute themselves as a people, perhaps on a non-racial basis. As I said, one of those stories we're exploring and beginning to do research is that of a family of Holocaust survivors who called the building home in the mid to late 1950s. They arrived in 1947. This is their declaration of intent to become citizens, created and signed and submitted shortly after they arrived. Carmen and Regina Epstein were their names. We've recently been in contact with one of their daughters, their eldest daughter, whose name is Bella Epstein-Seligson. She has shared with us remarkable stories, I think, stories that we're unable to uncover or recover in the case of 97 Orchard's earlier waves of immigration, and in particular kind of the interethnic relations that unfolded within the halls of this other building at 103 Orchard. She, for example, tells about the strong relationships and friendships made with neighbors, including the Italian immigrant and Italian-American De Benedetto family, who regularly shared in the joy of watching wrestling programs on the Epstein's new black and white Zenith television, again in the mid to late 1950s. We're also moving into the 1960s and 1970s when the demographics of the building began to change even further. And here you can see both the 1966 and 1968 telephone directories, essentially the telephone book, one of the few sources we have to recover some of the actual site-specific stories in this building. And you can begin to see some of the sort of the change here in this building as Italian-American, Jewish-American, Lower East Siders either passed away or moved out of the neighborhood and were replaced by newcomers like Howard Ho and Florence Quinones, Chinese and Puerto Rican respectively. We've taken the opportunity that many of these folks continue to live in this building in rent-regulated or rent-controlled apartments to capture their stories through the process of oral history. We've interviewed, for example, Mrs. Suha Lau and her daughter Teresa. They moved into apartment 7 on the 3rd floor of the building in 1976. And Mrs. Lau continues, as I've said, to call the apartment home. The broad outlines of their story have begun to emerge. Mrs. Lau arrived in New York from Hong Kong in 1975. She had been born in a village in Taishan and fled to Hong Kong during the upheavals of Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 1950s with her husband and 3 children. They had 3 more children in Hong Kong, 3 boys and 3 girls. Her husband emigrated first here to Brazil and later joined them in New York in the late 1970s. Eventually, all of them lived in this apartment together, and she states in her interview, I'm going to quote here, "Myself, with 3 young children, when the overage children, meaning the older children, came from Hong Kong, it became crowded. The eldest daughter and her family came. There were many, many people. There were beds everywhere. It was just barely enough room. People were too afraid to live here. It was a rough neighborhood. Even though the rent was cheap, nobody wanted to live here." We've recently been moving into a kind of virtual version of this exhibit because, of course, as I should say, the museum is not in the business of evicting any of these folks from their homes to create a museum exhibit that tells their stories. And so we're hoping to kind of launch this on a virtual platform to set the stage for the eventual physical exhibit. Here's Mrs. Lau. Pictured it is still from a video interview we did with her recently. Here she is in the hallway outside of her apartment doing the Tai Chi exercises that she does still in her late 80s, walking down to Columbus Park in the heart of Chinatown on a daily basis if she says the weather is cooperating. With visitors to this virtual tour, which will be hosted on the museum's website, through oral history, whether that's audio or video. You can see the toolbox that is there. And that's connected to what's pictured here and will ultimately tell the story, or help tell the story of the Sias family's eldest son, who when they moved in 1968 at the age of 17 became the building superintendent or caretaker. And as it's pretty difficult to read the entire quote, but he talks about how he was, quote, an immigrant trying to make a buck, hustling to save every penny, and working hard to gain a foothold in his new home. We hope that this new exhibit, both the virtual and the physical one, will not only strengthen the ways in which we tell the stories of immigrant life on Manhattan's Lower East Side by bringing our story closer to the present, laying side by side the stories of actual immigrant residents from our museum buildings, both European and non-European, the late 19th, early 20th century, late 20th century, and of course, early 21st. We also hope that this will encourage members of the communities represented in the exhibit, Chinese, Latino, and otherwise, to view the museum as telling part of their story. What is more, as part of this process, we've engaged them in a larger oral history project, part of which is pictured here at a community event in which we invited members of these communities to the museum. One of our oral historians, Tommy Wu, there pictured on the right, he does many of our interviews in Chinese with Mrs. Lau and others, but really engage them not only in sharing their own stories, but and actively helping to shape how this story, though site-specific and of actual residents of this building, as a kind of representation of themselves and of their own stories. And so, again, I think the museum's approach to this work will undoubtedly evolve as the neighborhood, as the city evolves, as the United States evolves. But we are in some way committed to the spirit of a sort of usable past as told through the Lower East Side as an immigrant gateway, an immigrant neighborhood. Thank you.